Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to uncover how a 4,000-year encyclopedia of blood, faith, and survival follows a single, almost invisible thread. We're talking about massive wars, deep betrayals, unbelievable miracles, and devastating massacres. We're talking about entire empires rising up in total glory, only to crumble into dust. You know, the Old Testament isn't just some random collection of disconnected ancient stories. It's a sweeping, epic narrative that covers more time than literally any other record in human history.
So here's the big question we need to ask. How does a text written by dozens of different authors, across different centuries, and even on different continents, manage to tell a story so absurdly coherent that it almost feels scripted from beginning to end? Well, we're going to track this epic mystery together. We'll go from the very first particle of light in the universe all the way to the last prophet crying out in the desert. And as you'll see, it all reveals a master plan pointing to a truly shocking, unresolved conclusion. All right, let's start at the very beginning. Section 1. Creation and the Fall. Our explainer begins in absolute nothingness, before the very concepts of time or space even existed. No matter, no light, just nothing. There's this Hebrew phrase, tohu vabohu, and it perfectly describes that absolute void, a complete, formless nothingness. And then, from the midst of that dark void, a voice simply says, "Let there be light." No tools, no raw materials, just a spoken command. But notice this incredibly intimate detail that happens on the sixth day. Humanity wasn't just spoken into existence from millions of miles away like the stars or the oceans were. God actually stopped and physically molded man from the dust, breathing life right into his nostrils. It sets up this unique, highly personal relationship right from the starting line.
And honestly, that intimate relationship makes the tragedy that follows so much sharper. Just compare the effortless paradise of Eden, a place with real physical rivers like the Tigris and Euphrates, gold, fruit trees, and absolutely zero death or pain. Compare that with the cursed ground. We're talking thorns, sweat, relentless labor, and ultimately mortality. This stark contrast became our everyday reality because of one simple rule that got distorted by a serpent. And the wild thing is, the serpent didn't even lie directly at first. It just planted the very first seed of doubt into human history by asking, did God really say? Adam and Eve break the rule, and death enters the world like a virus. They're expelled, and an angel with a flaming sword literally blocks the way back.
Moving right along to Section 2, Flood and Dispersal. Basically, a heartbreaking cosmic reset. See, humanity multiplies rapidly, but so does their corruption. The text actually tells us that every thought of the human heart was only evil continually. And that leads to a totally heartbreaking reset for the creator of the universe. 150. That is the number of days Noah's Ark floated in absolute darkness. God had instructed Noah to build this massive 450-foot survival box. It wasn't a ship with a steering wheel, it was just a box to survive in. And here's the chilling detail in the text. God, not Noah, but God himself sealed the door from the outside, wiping out everything that breathed on dry land as water burst from the deep and rained down from the sky. Which brings us to Section 3, the promise to Abraham. Out of the linguistic chaos of the Tower of Babel, the text makes this radical zoom in. It pans away from all of humanity to focus entirely on one elderly, nomadic man living in a tent. So, the absolutely crucial point here is this monumental promise. God tells Abram, this elderly guy with a barren wife, "I will make of you a great nation, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." Then, God asks Abraham to wait 25 painful years for a child, Isaac. And just when you think the story is settled, here comes the ultimate test. God asks him to sacrifice that beloved son on Mount Moriah. Isaac is literally carrying his own wood up the hill. But at the very last second, an angel stops the knife, and a substitute ram appears, caught in a thicket. That moment plants a massive prophetic seed for the future. This invisible thread of providence keeps weaving through Abraham's son Isaac, then to Jacob, and then to Jacob's descendants, specifically a guy named Joseph. Now, Joseph is hated by his brothers, thrown into a pit, and sold into slavery for 20 pieces of silver. He even ends up rotting in an Egyptian dungeon. Yet, through this miraculous ability to interpret Pharaoh's dreams, Joseph rises to become the second most powerful man in all of Egypt. He ends up saving millions from starvation, including the very brothers who betrayed him in the first place. When Joseph finally confronts them, he drops this profound realization. As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good. It completely proves that God can and does redirect human chaos to fulfill his master plan. Let's jump to Section 4, Exodus and the Law. 400 years later, Joseph's family has exploded into a nation of 2 million Hebrews. But sadly, they're enslaved in Egypt. A forgotten promise is awakened when a Hebrew baby, saved from genocide by the very Egyptian princess whose father ordered his death, returns from the desert. That boy is Moses, and he returns to face Pharaoh. Now, notice the exact precision of the 10 plagues. Water turning to blood, frogs, flies, 3 whole days of pitch darkness. These were not just random, flashy magic tricks. They were a systematic, targeted dismantling of the Egyptian gods. And it all culminates in the 10th plague, the Passover. This was a liberation entirely bought by the blood of a substitute lamb painted on the doorposts of the Hebrews' homes. Pharaoh finally lets them go, and they miraculously cross the Red Sea on dry ground, walking right between 2 solid walls of water. But wow, look at how quickly things go south. Compare the sheer glory of Mount Sinai, where God descends in literal fire, smoke, and earthquakes to speak the 10 Commandments, with what happens next. The golden calf, just 40 days later. While Moses is still up on the mountain getting the blueprints for the tabernacle, the people get restless and manufacture an idol out of melted gold earrings. The tragic irony of this whole situation is that it was easy to take Israel out of Egypt, but it was almost impossible to take Egypt out of Israel. And that leads us into Section 5, Kings, Prophets, and Exile. After wandering for 40 years and conquering Canaan, things get incredibly messy. The Israelites descend into an era of complete moral anarchy. For over 300 years, they're trapped in this exhausting, tragic cycle. First, they rebel against God. Second, they face the consequence of enemy oppression. Third, getting desperate, they cry out, and God mercifully raises up a temporary deliverer, a judge like Gideon or Samson. That gives them step 4, a brief new beginning, before they inevitably fall right back into sin and start the loop all over again. This relentless cycle finally forces the people to demand a human king, which sets up an incredible contrast in leadership styles. God gives them King Saul first. Saul looks the part, he's tall and handsome, but when he's confronted with his disobedience, he just offers empty excuses. Then God chooses King David, the shepherd boy who dropped a 9-foot giant with a single stone. Well, later in life, David feels terribly. He becomes an adulterous murderer. But here's the difference. When he's confronted by the prophet Nathan, David doesn't make a single excuse. He immediately weeps and repents. Despite his massive, glaring failures, David's sincere repentance makes him a man after God's own heart. Because of that, God shoots a massive arrow into the air by promising David an eternal throne. But unfortunately, David's descendants completely failed to keep the covenant, and the kingdom splinters into this tragic timeline of falling empires. In 722 BC, Assyria wipes out the northern kingdom of Israel. Then, in 586 BC, Babylon does the unthinkable. King Nebuchadnezzar destroys Jerusalem, burns Solomon's magnificent temple down to its very foundations, and drags the people into exile. Eventually, in 539 BC, Persia conquers Babylon and lets the Jews return to rebuild. But it's so bittersweet, right? The Ark of the Covenant is missing. That ancient glory is just gone. Finally, in 430 BC, the prophet Malachi delivers his final message. And that brings us to our final stop, Section 6, the unfinished sentence. After Malachi writes those final prophetic words, heavy, almost deafening silence falls over the entire narrative. 400. For 400 years, there is not a single prophetic voice. Heaven just goes totally quiet. Entire generations are born, live their lives, and die without hearing a single new word, leaving the audience waiting in this agonizing suspense. Because think about it, all those promises from throughout history, they're just hanging there in the air. Here's the first suspended arrow. David's eternal throne remains completely empty. That grand promise made to Israel's greatest king is just left hanging, totally unfulfilled. And here's the second suspended arrow. Isaiah's suffering servant has not yet appeared. This mysterious, vital figure that the prophet Isaiah wrote about centuries earlier, someone who was supposed to be wounded for their transgressions and crushed for their iniquities, is nowhere to be found. And the third suspended arrow, Jeremiah's new covenant written on the heart, it hasn't begun either. The seed of the woman who would crush the serpent, the blessing of Abraham for all nations, it's all paused. The entire Old Testament, it turns out, is not a collection of fables. It's a single, continuous arc that just stops abruptly. It's literally the intermission before the final act. So, I want to leave you with this final provocative thought. The Old Testament doesn't end with a period, it ends with a comma. So what happens after the comma? If every war, every single blood sacrifice, every specific prophecy, and every failed human king points to something that hasn't even happened yet, what could possibly complete this epic sentence?